Welcome to Common Ground Discourse, everyone. We are your co-hosts. My name is Shane Swor.
God's peace, I am Brother Kenneth Hosley.
All right, so this is our final installment of the topic of guns in schools. And for this particular episode, we are going to be focusing on solutions. And, actually something I'd like to bring up before we get into it too much as a reminder for those who haven't been listening to the other episodes. My interlocutor here, Kenneth Hosley, is obviously my co-host, but he is also a teacher in the Metro Atlanta area. So he offers a very unique perspective on his thoughts with how guns work in schools from the perspective of a teacher. And myself, being a citizen in all this that is completely undecided, I personally don't have enough data to make a call one way or the other. But again, that's why we're having these conversations. Something else just real quick I want to point out as to not introduce another conversation, but we are solely focused on guns in schools. We're not trying to push an agenda of gun ownership in homes. I feel it's a completely different conversation that perhaps we could visit at another point.
But this is specifically about arming teachers.
Yeah. So we for all of our listeners on whether you swing left or right, we just want to make that clear. And to maybe ease the minds of some of those out there. I mean, I personally have a different perspective of guns in the home. I own a gun, although I don't consider myself a gun owner. I don't practice with it. I rarely take it out of the case. I have no ammunition. But just to drive it home that neither one of us are we don't have a phobia of guns. Right. We're just focused on the conversation of guns in schools. So I just felt like it was necessary to kind of just bring that up for those who might be listening and thinking, oh, we're just anti-gun, all this stuff. That's not the case. We're looking at this with a critical eye, and we're considering all of the aspects that go into arming teachers. So yes, without further preamble, let's get into solutions with how we move forward with this. And Kenneth, I know you have interesting perspectives on this and some interesting solutions. And I'd like just for a moment for you to share some of your ideas on what we ought to consider going forward with this. How do we solve violence in schools? Yeah.
Well, clearly before we can address the solution, we need to be precise and accurate with what the problem is. Mm-hmm. And there are two prongs to this problem. And as reticent as I am to ever tip my hat to President Donald Trump, I will give him credit on this one, that when the issues or the events at Parkland happened, what he went to was mental illness. Mm-hmm. Now, whether he went to that so he would avoid the gun conversation or not, that's another thing. But that mental illness was the issue, I think, is important. And from my own perspective, as in a Metro Atlanta school with students who are vast majority African American or Latinx, I also want to point out that in our society, how racist or racially persuaded our reactions are. That if it's a white killer, we'll call it mental illness. If it is a black killer, we'll call them a thug. Mm-hmm. So I do want that on the table, that if we're going to talk about mental illness, this is across the board. It is a human issue, a societal issue that we need to take care of.
Well, not to interrupt, but I'd like to say that we've examined this on our previous discussion when we were discussing the moral landscape.
Right.
These are real factors. We're talking about the brain and how we operate, the decisions we make on a moral level. And briefly, we talked about that. When it comes to justice being retributive or restorative, if somebody does something that we deem immoral, but we look at two different cases where in one case the killer had a tumor in his brain, for example. Right. I mean, we can consider that some sort of mental handicap. These are real things that we must consider. Right. So I just wanted to inject that a little bit into the conversation, but as you were saying.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's good to remember that the biology, because we have a stigma against mental illness. Mm-hmm. There is an American sentiment against seeking therapy and professional help. Mm-hmm. That if it's a physical ailment, then we understand that's something you can't help. So good for you for overcoming that. Mm-hmm. But if it's a mental issue, You just need to suck it up and be better at what you're doing.
Yeah.
That is more of a personal decision to be mentally ill, which is untrue.
Ludicrous.
But again, we need to address all the problems before we can address the solution. So one is mental illness, which we need to discuss, which I think is the heart of this. The other side is the accessibility of firearms in this adoration, which we addressed in our first segment on this, the romanticized view, the addiction that we have to weapons. And I don't want to spend too much on that because that's what has been so much of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's the easiest solution. As much as it's to fight in Congress, the idea of gun control and limiting weapons, which in my personal opinion still needs to be done because there are certain weapons that we just don't need in the public. Mm-hmm. If it's not accessible, then it can't be used. And there are ways of restricting it. But more importantly, it's the mental illness. And this is where I think we have fallen down the most. Mm-hmm. And the reason we avoid it is because if we do actually walk into this, one, America has to deal with its own discomfort with mental illness. It has to admit that mental illness is a real issue that needs to be addressed, that's not the victim's fault. Mm-hmm. And we need to understand and accept just how huge the solution is going to have to be. It's pervasive, it is time-consuming, and it will require society's effort, not Congress's legislation. Mm-hmm. We now have to become active participants in this solution. If it's gun control, then it's a law that will take care of it, not us. If it's mental illness within the community, we each are invested in doing our part to make it better. Which is probably why people want to avoid it. Economically, it is more feasible to throw a gun at a teacher than it is to invest the money into having trained staff in schools that would deal with this.
Right.
Jay-Z, for instance, several weeks before Parkland, was in the news because he made the radical suggestion that every school should have a therapist on staff. Mm. Now, working in the school where I do, I kind of laughed at that because there's no one therapist that can take care of that many students. But it was a huge step forward. Because he, as a public figure, was willing to admit that a therapist is an essential job, an important position in society that is crucial for the development of our children. Whether or not we admit it for adults, which most adults don't want to admit, at least children will have a better start because they're coming from homes that are broken, they're coming from communities that aren't supportive, that they need the therapy to work through, find the tools to deal with the trauma they've had as children. Mm-hmm. And I have so many students that I spend more time trying to figure out what their triggers are than what their academic deficiencies are. Mm. And I tell my students time again, I have to teach you behavior before I can teach you material because I can't teach you the latter without the former. And this is real. So for us to deal with mental illness, if we're going to effectively approach this, and when I preached on this a few weeks ago for Lent, just after the events, we as a society have to take the responsibility for what has happened. That if society allowed, and the more we hear in the news, there were warning signs, people knew, they didn't do anything. We have to take responsibility for allowing that to happen. That we allowed Parkland to happen. We allowed Columbine to happen. You don't get to blame a shooter. You don't get to blame the shooter's parents. We have to take responsibility that we allowed that to happen. Not just allowed it, but we have made a society that allowed that to happen.
Well, in many cases, it's been non-action. That's what we have to recognize, I think. The whole, we've talked about this before, pacifism is making a decision. It's not exculpating yourself from responsibility simply because you didn't act. Mm-hmm. The act of not acting in itself is a choice that you make. Right. And you cannot say, especially when you have the resources to solve a problem, that you were not responsible. Mm-hmm.
We can't think that, if you look at my school, the idea of putting a therapist there I think is brilliant, although they're going to need a lot more than just one. Mm-hmm. You can't think of a school counselor as a therapist, first off, because school counselors, they're more, I don't want to denigrate my school counselors because they're amazing women and they're Herculean in what they do, but they're a more like social workers. They siphon students into DFACs when needed. Mm-hmm. They make the call to see when outside help is necessary. And the bulk of what they do is trying to make sure a student has the classes they need to graduate. That's what they're supposed to be doing. They are not licensed therapists. We're not supposed to be that private therapist that a student can go to and work through their problems. Mm-hmm. These counselors do that kind of work, but it is different than having a dedicated therapist. Theirs is more spot checking when the issue flares up.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting is to get a more specialized individual in the schools that, not just for this particular instance, but maybe for others that are serious and maybe related, to have them in there to be able to spot this out.
Right.
This way, we obviously we mitigate that step of bias. You know, who do we task with this responsibility to spot these risk factors? You get someone who's trained in there. Right. So let's talk about what, as a solution. Then we're rolling this out. What does that look like in terms of costs versus arming teachers? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the cost of arming a teacher, take the latest Florida legislation that's gone through. They're looking at millions of dollars, which seems a terrible, huge sum.
Yeah.
And especially when you already have schools that are short of supplies, everyone's asking, well, where did this money suddenly come from if you couldn't give us dry erase markers in the first place? Mm-hmm. But that cynicism aside, the general cost is the training once a year. They're only arming 10 teachers per school. So you have the cost of the gun for 10 of them. You have the cost of training for 10 teachers once a year. You have a one-time $500 bonus. So the recurring fee after that point is only the training for 10 teachers each summer as they go through. Everything else is up front. The cost of a gun, it is not that much. I mean, you can get a handgun, they're fairly cheap. And the $500 bonus is a wash in the end. Mm-hmm. So while it looks like millions of dollars across a state, sure. Now let's talk about actually dealing with the mental illness as opposed to an active shooter. If you want to address the mental illness before they become an active shooter, you're going to have a therapist, several therapists on campus. So that's another full-time staff. So you're looking between $40,000 to $60,000, depending on your school, your district, per therapist per year. So that is now a recurring fee every single year, as opposed to the only recurring fee of the annual training for the gun. You also have to look at the structure of school. How are you going to pull a student from class so they can go to this? You're going to have to do remediation work so they make up the work when they're out of class, going through therapy. How are you going to structure that into this? You have the training with the teachers. You now have to train teachers to better effectively identify mental illness so they can direct the student to the therapist. You have to train the teacher to reinforce the tools that the therapist is teaching the student so they're using that in class. There's a lot more training that goes behind this. There has to be a lot more outreach into the community. And now this is beyond the economic impact of the school. Now we're looking at the social cost for the community that theoretically wants safer schools. And I'll put this on the table that if anyone says they want safer schools, if that is what you actually believe, then you have to be the one willing to make the investment of your time and energy to do it. If not, don't put it on someone else's shoulders.
Right.
So if we're going to look at the community, how are we as a community going to mentor these students? How are you going to go into a school? When are you going to go into a school and be the big brother or big sister that we need? When are you going to be the one that sets up the after-school program so kids have a safe place to go so they don't resort to violence that's already there? Where are you going to be the one that will pick up the loner so he has a place to belong as opposed to crying out by killing other people? Where are you going to be the safe place where he finds good structure as opposed to finding neo-Nazi websites online that give him a sense of identity?
Right.
That's the real cost. Yeah. Which isn't just money, and that's probably why everyone shies away from it, because to address mental illness in our society is a huge investment and a huge shift in our own culpability.
It is, but let's look at the other solution that's being proposed here. Upfront costs, which seem like obviously it's an operating expense keeping counselors in schools in the numbers that are needed. But at face value, it seems that the first round of solution by arming teachers and giving them the limited training that they need might at first seem cheaper. But, so in my background professionally, random tidbit, working with Six Sigma, and it's a system, not just Six Sigma, but continual improvement and development. When problems come up, you implement something else to improve it. Let's go through the rings here. So with the program of arming teachers, let's say we get to a point where we realize, well, maybe it's not enough training. Now I have to pay for more. You've already implemented this program. Now you have to run with the costs of improvement.
Since you've already invested, you don't want to lose the investment.
Right.
So you're committed to putting more money
into it. It's already there.
Right.
And long term, it could very well be that arming the teachers is far more expensive than just getting the counselors in there. And so let that thought detonate in your mind for a moment, that a quick, easy solution will need improvement on both ends, but with the tools and the training and the psychological impact of putting a weapon for murder in the hands of a teacher could, in the long term, be more expensive than you think.
Right.
So, and to kind of to build on all of this, for the students who are bravely taking the lead in media and becoming figures for change, I keep pushing forward with that. At the same time, I encourage everyone who's pushing for this change to roll up their sleeves and to look at what legislation we need to pass. Let's really arm ourselves and galvanize the movement of fixing this problem to make those proposals for solutions. I mean, this is what the right is asking for. And the broad conversation, you look at anyone, especially, let's just take Ben Shapiro, for example. This concept that the left is crying and the right doesn't see what the problem is.
Right.
What the left needs to do, because again, it's mostly the left pushing for this, acknowledge what the problem is, come up with the solutions, and make it detailed.
Right. When
you make it detailed with how it folds into legislation, appeal to what the right wants. But that's how you'll get further with honey than vinegar. Is that what the saying is? Or
yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, so yeah, we'll wrap it up there. And
I mean, the important thing is, and as much as everyone wants a response, as you've said, there's a desperate need to react now to fix it, especially from politicians that want to look relevant enough to be reelected. But we need to be careful, and I realize how inappropriate this pun is, but it's fitting. Whatever we come up with, it doesn't need to be so immediate or poorly thought out that it comes across as half-cocked.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, this is obvious. It's a solution that we don't... That might just be it. We'll shy away from a solution because we can't roll it out today. But this is something obviously long-term. So.
Right.
Excellent. Well, we hope that that this conversation has at least planted some seeds and some new perspectives, or maybe aligns with what you think already, and helps you navigate your own conversations to find a solution that we need. So thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.
We hope you've enjoyed what you've heard and engaging in our conversations here on Common Ground Discourse. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to us on YouTube.
You can also find us on Facebook under the same name, Common Ground Discourse. Please follow us on there, as we will be posting updates and other areas where you can find our content. Thank you.
God's peace.